The coffin was so terribly small. That was the first thing I thought, standing there in the black dress I'd bought for this day and would probably never wear again. It's a strange thing, the mind, what it latches onto to keep from drowning. The polished oak, the brass handles gleaming under the muted chapel lights, the perfect, sickening symmetry of it all. My father, the man who had always seemed like a giant to me, reduced to a box that looked like it could barely hold a child. I kept my eyes on it, a fixed point in a sea of blurry faces and muted sobs. If I looked away, even for a second, I might actually believe this was happening. The air was thick with the smell of lilies and grief, a cloying, sweet scent that made my stomach turn. People shuffled past me, a conveyor belt of condolences. Their hands were soft and damp on mine, their voices a low, buzzing hum of "I'm so sorry, Alara, and he was a good man." Their words washed over me, meaningless sounds. I was an architect, I built things. I understood structures, load-bearing walls, the precise mathematics that kept something standing against the weight of the world. But this was a demolition. The central pillar of my life was gone, and the blueprint for what came next was a blank, terrifying page. My father, Arthur, was a quiet man. His silence wasn't empty, it was a presence, a room in our house you knew not to enter. He was a history teacher, and he could talk for hours about the fall of empires, the intricate causes of wars, the lives of people long turned to dust. But ask him about his own past, about the years before my mother, before me, and the shutters would come down. His eyes, the same shade of storm gray as mine, would drift to some distant point only he could see, and he'd offer a vague, "That was a different lifetime, Ellie." I'd built my entire understanding of him on that silence, assuming it was just the texture of a gentle, academic man. A man whose greatest battles were fought with chalk and red ink. The service was a quiet, respectable affair, just as he would have wanted. No grand eulogies, no tearful public displays. He'd written his own instructions, a single, typed page tucked into his will, as meticulous and private in death as he was in life. I sat in the front pew, my back straight, my hands folded in my lap, trying to emulate his stoicism. My fiancé, David, sat beside me, a warm, solid pressure against my side, his presence a comfort I couldn't fully let in. My grief felt like a private room, and I was locking the door from the inside. It was as the last hymn was being sung, a soft, mournful melody that I can't even recall now, that I first saw him. He was standing at the very back of the chapel, half hidden in the shadows of the doorway. He wasn't like the others. He wasn't dressed in the somber, respectful black of the other mourners. He wore a worn, brown leather jacket, and his posture was rigid, not with grief, but with a kind of tense alertness, like a soldier at attention. His face was weathered, etched with lines that spoke of sun and hard years, and his hair was a thick, silver-gray mane. But it was his eyes that held me. They were fixed on the coffin with an intensity that felt violent in that place of soft sorrow. It wasn't just sadness I saw there, it was a raw, consuming anguish, a look of such profound, personal loss that it seemed to eclipse everyone else's. A cold finger of unease traced its way down my spine. Who was he? I ran through the mental list of my father's friends, colleagues, former students. None of them fit. This man was an outsider. He was a question mark standing in the back of a church full of periods. As the service ended and people began to file out, I lost sight of him. The crowd swallowed him up. For a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined him, a phantom conjured by my own fractured state. We moved outside into the weak, late afternoon sunlight for the burial. The air was crisp, a relief after the stifling chapel. The grass was a startling, vibrant green, a cruel contrast to the dark hole waiting for my father. I stood by the graveside, the damp earth seeping cold through the thin soles of my shoes, listening to the final prayers. I let a handful of soil fall from my fingers onto the coffin lid. The finality of the sound, the soft thud of earth on wood, was a physical blow. It was over. People began to disperse, heading back to their cars, to the reception at my father's house. I lingered, unable to make my feet move, unable to turn my back on that hole in the ground. David squeezed my hand. "Take your time," he whispered, and moved a few paces away to give me a moment of privacy. And that's when I saw the stranger again. He was standing under a large, gnarled oak tree at the edge of the cemetery, watching me. Our eyes met across the distance. He didn't look away, didn't offer a sympathetic smile. He just held my gaze, his expression unreadable. Then, he started walking towards me. My heart began to beat a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Every instinct told me to turn, to walk quickly to David and the safety of the car. But I was rooted to the spot, held by the gravity of that man's approach. He moved with a slight limp, a stiff-legged gait that spoke of an old injury. He stopped a few feet from me. Up close, he was older than I'd first thought, maybe in his late 70s. The lines on his face were deep canyons, and his eyes, a pale, watery blue, were haunted. "Elara," he said. His voice was rough, gravelly, as if from disuse. The sound of my name in his mouth was a shock. It felt intimate, invasive. How did he know me? I had never seen this man before in my life. I'm sorry, do I know you? I managed, my own voice thin and reedy. He shook his head, a slow, sad movement. No. You don't. He looked past me, at the fresh mound of earth. The pain on his face was so naked it was almost difficult to look at. I knew your father. A long time ago. This must be a very difficult day for you, too, I said, falling back on polite, automatic responses, the social script you're supposed to follow. A strange, bitter smile touched his lips, there and gone in an instant. You have no idea, he murmured, almost to himself. He turned his piercing gaze back to me. He was the best man I ever knew. And the worst. The words hung in the air between us, stark and impossible. They made no sense. The best and the worst? My father, who corrected papers with a gentle hand, who made terrible puns over breakfast, who cried at old war documentaries. What could this stranger possibly mean? I don't understand, I said, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. He looked at me for a long moment, as if weighing me, judging whether I could bear the weight of whatever he was carrying. There's a story, he said finally, his voice dropping so low I had to lean in to hear him. A story about your father and me. About what happened in a place called Kisan. Kisan. The name meant nothing to me. It sounded foreign, exotic, and dangerous. He never spoke of it, I said, a statement that had defined my entire life. I know he didn't, the stranger replied. He made a promise. And Arthur was a man who kept his promises. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. For a wild, irrational second, I thought he might pull out a weapon. But what he withdrew was a small, faded, black and white photograph. The edges were worn soft, the image grainy. He held it out to me. Hesitantly, I took it. It was a photograph of two young soldiers, their arms slung around each other's shoulders, grinning widely. They were lean, caked in mud, their uniforms filthy and torn. They looked exhausted and exhilarated, alive in a way that only the young staring into the abyss can be. One of them was unmistakably my father. A version of my father I had never seen. His face was unlined, his eyes bright with a fierce, untamed light, a cigarette dangling from his lips. The other man was the stranger, decades younger, his features sharp and clear, his smile a flash of white in a grimy face. They called us the bookends, the stranger said, a ghost of that old smile in his voice. Him with his history books, me with my, well, that's the story, isn't it? I stared at the photograph, my mind reeling. My father, a soldier? He had never, not once, mentioned serving. When I was a child and asked about the small, pale scar on his shoulder, he'd said it was from a biking accident. All those vague answers about his past, his reluctance to talk about his youth, it wasn't just academic introspection. It was a wall. A wall built around this. Who are you? I whispered, my voice trembling. My name is Samuel Finley, he said. But your father, he called me Finn. He looked at the grave one last time, his eyes closing briefly as if in pain. He saved my life, Elara. And in doing so, he destroyed it. Before I could form a question, before I could even process his words, he turned and began to walk away, his limp more pronounced now. Wait! I called out, taking a step after him. What does that mean? What happened? He didn't look back. He just raised a hand in a gesture that was neither a wave nor a dismissal, but something infinitely sadder, and continued walking, disappearing behind a row of headstones. I stood there, clutching the photograph, the world tilting on its axis. The solid ground of my past had just been ripped out from under me. My father, the quiet history teacher, had been a soldier. He had a friend named Finn who looked at him with a love and a hatred so intertwined they had become the same thing. And he had a secret he had taken to his grave, a secret this stranger had just laid at my feet. The reception at my father's house was a surreal affair. The rooms were filled with the low murmur of voices, the clinking of teacups, plates laden with sandwiches and cakes that no one really had an appetite for. People came up to me, their faces soft with pity, telling stories about my father, the brilliant teacher, the kind neighbor, the man who always had a joke for the cashier at the grocery store. And all I could do was nod and smile a tight, brittle smile, the photograph of the two young soldiers burning a hole in my clutch purse. Every story they told felt like a lie now. Or if not a lie, then a facade, a carefully constructed performance my father had maintained for over 40 years. Who was he? The question echoed in my mind, drowning out the well-meaning condolences. The man who loved crossword puzzles and birdwatching, or the mud-streaked soldier grinning in a war zone? David noticed my distraction. "You okay?" he asked quietly, putting a hand on the small of my back. "You've been somewhere else all afternoon." I looked into his kind, concerned face. David was an architect, like me. We understood each other. We believed in plans, invisible, tangible structures. How could I explain that the man he'd known and respected, the man who had welcomed him into the family with a firm handshake and a discussion about Frank Lloyd Wright, was a complete stranger? How could I tell him that the foundation of the life I was about to build with him was suddenly built on quicksand? "I'm just tired," I lied, forcing another smile. "It's been a long day." Later, when everyone was gone and David had gone home, promising to check on me first thing in the morning, the silence of the house descended. It was my childhood home, every corner, every piece of furniture saturated with memory. The worn armchair where my father would sit and read, the desk where he'd grade papers late into the night, the smell of old books and lemon polish. It had always been a place of comfort, of certainty. Now, it felt like a museum dedicated to a man who never existed. I went upstairs to his bedroom. I hadn't been able to bring myself to go in since his death. The door creaked open, revealing a room frozen in time. His reading glasses were on the nightstand, folded neatly next to a half-finished book on the Byzantine Empire. His slippers were peeking out from under the bed. It was too much. I sank onto the edge of the mattress, the worn quilt soft beneath my hands, and finally, I let the tears come. They were tears of grief, yes, but also of confusion and a deep, unsettling fear. When the storm passed, I felt hollowed out. My eyes fell on the old, oak wardrobe in the corner. It was where he kept his sweaters, his winter coats, and, I now realized with a jolt, perhaps other things. Things from that other lifetime. I crossed the room and pulled the doors open. The familiar scent of cedar and his faint, clean cologne washed over me. I pushed aside the hanging clothes, my fingers brushing against the rough wool of his favorite cardigan. At the back of the wardrobe, on the floor, was a small, metal lockbox. I'd seen it before, throughout my childhood. I'd asked him about it once, and he'd said it was for important papers. Tax stuff, boring things. I'd never given it a second thought. Now, I lifted it out. It was heavier than I expected. It was locked, a small, sturdy keyhole staring back at me. Where would the key be? I looked around the room. My father was a creature of habit. He kept a spare house key in a small dish on his dresser. I went to the dresser and sifted through the contents of the dish, loose change, a button, a worn leather fob. And there, nestled among the detritus, was a small, brass key. My hand shook as I fitted it into the lock. It turned with a smooth, well-oiled click. I lifted the lid. Inside, there were no stocks, no bonds, no boring tax papers. There was a life. His other life. On top was his military discharge paper. I unfolded it carefully. Arthur James Vance. Sergeant. United States Marine Corps. Vietnam. The dates, the places, the formal, bureaucratic language, it was all there, a cold, hard record of the truth. Beneath it was a small bundle of letters, tied with a faded ribbon. The paper was brittle, the ink smudged in places. They were letters to my mother, written before they were married. I skimmed one, my heart aching. "My dearest Eleanor," it began. "The rain here is endless. It has a sound all its own, a constant drumming on the canopy that gets inside your head. I try not to think about it. I think of you instead, of the sound of your laugh, of the way you tuck your hair behind your ear when you're reading. I think of the life we'll have when this is all over. A quiet life. A safe life. I never want to hear this rain again. A quiet life." A safe life. He had gotten his wish. He had built that life, brick by brick, with a fierce, deliberate determination. And he had buried the man who wrote this letter deep, so deep that even his own daughter never knew he existed. Under the letters was a small, cloth patch, the emblem of the Marine Corps. And beneath that, at the very bottom of the box, was a single, dog-eared black and white photograph, a duplicate of the one Samuel Finley had given me. My father and Finn, brothers in arms. But there was one more thing. A small, leather-bound notebook. I picked it up. It wasn't a diary. The pages were filled not with personal reflections, but with lists. Dates. Coordinates. Technical-looking diagrams. And names. Dozens of names, written in my father's precise, architect-like handwriting. Most of them were crossed out with a single, neat line. At the top of one page, underlined twice, was the word lighthouse. And on the very last page, tucked into the binding, was a folded piece of paper, separate from the rest. I unfolded it. It was a letter, addressed to me. My dearest Ellie. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have found the key. I had hoped you would never have to see this box. I had hoped to carry this with me, to let it be buried with me. But a small, selfish part of me couldn't bring myself to destroy it all. A part of me needed someone to know that he existed. That I existed. The man in the photograph is Samuel Finley. We served together. He was my best friend. He was the bravest man I ever knew. What happened to him, what I did, it is a burden I have carried every day of my life since. I made a choice, Ellie. In a split second, in a place of unspeakable terror, I made a choice. I have spent 40 years asking myself if it was the right one. I have never found an answer. He will tell you I saved him. He will tell you I betrayed him. Both are true. Do not judge him too harshly. And please, try not to judge me. I built the life you knew, the life with you and your mother, as a sanctuary from that other one. It was the only way I knew how to live with what I had done. I love you more than anything in this world. Dad. The words blurred on the page. I read them again and again, trying to make sense of them. A choice. A betrayal that was also a salvation. A secret so profound it had shaped my entire childhood, the very air I breathed in this house. The silence I had always attributed to his personality wasn't silence at all. It was the roaring, deafening noise of a past he could never escape. I looked at the photograph of the two young men, their faces full of life and hope. I thought of the old, broken man at the cemetery, his eyes full of a pain so old it had become part of his bones. And I thought of my father, my quiet, gentle father, carrying this horrific weight all alone, building a wall of books and quiet routine to keep the monsters at bay. I couldn't leave it here. I couldn't just close the box and put it back in the wardrobe and pretend I hadn't seen it. The architect in me, the part that needed to understand the underlying structure, the foundation, couldn't walk away from a mystery that was now the central pillar of my own history. My father's letter wasn't an explanation, it was a door, cracked open into a dark room. I had to step inside. I had to find Samuel Finley. I had to find out what happened at a place called Kisan. The search began the next day. The internet, that vast, modern repository of information, had very little on a Samuel Finley. It was a common name, and the man I was looking for seemed to have deliberately avoided leaving a digital footprint. I found a few property records, an old phone listing that was decades out of date. It was a dead end. I went back to the lockbox. The notebook. The lists, the names, the word lighthouse. It felt like a code, a map to a place I didn't know how to read. I spread the pages out on my father's desk, under the warm glow of his green glass banker's lamp. I studied the diagrams. They weren't architectural. They looked mechanical. Schematics for some kind of device. And the names. I recognized none of them. They were all men, I assumed. Were they his squad? His unit? Frustrated, I turned to the only other concrete thing I had, his discharge papers. They listed his unit, his service number. With a deep breath, I picked up the phone and called the National Personnel Records Center. I was passed from one department to another, put on hold for what felt like an eternity. When I finally explained what I was looking for, information on my father's service, specifically regarding a man named Samuel Finley, the voice on the other end was polite but firm. I'm sorry, ma'am. Without a power of attorney or a death certificate, and given the privacy laws, I can't release that information. Even with a death certificate, access to another service member's record would require their permission or next of kin status. Another dead end. I was about to hang up when a thought occurred to me. What about his own record? I asked. I have his discharge papers. Is there a way to get a more detailed file? His DD Form 214? There was a pause. You can request a copy, but it will take time. And it will contain largely the same information you have there. Unit, dates of service, medals. Medals. I looked down at the discharge paper. In the section for awards and decorations, it was blank. I had assumed that meant he hadn't received any. But now, I wondered. Thank you, I said, and hung up. I felt the first stirrings of true despair. The past was a locked room, and I had thrown away the key. I looked at my father's letter again. He will tell you I saved him. He will tell you I betrayed him. Maybe I was going about this the wrong way. Maybe I didn't need official records. Maybe the answer wasn't in the facts and figures, but in the story. And there was only one person left alive who knew that story. I had to find Finn. I spent the next 3 days in a fever of research. I drove to the address listed in the old phone record. It was a dilapidated apartment building on the wrong side of town, and the current tenant, a young woman with a baby on her hip, had never heard of Samuel Finley. I went to the local VFW hall. The old men playing cards inside were friendly, but they shook their heads. The name didn't ring a bell. One of them, a man with a kind face and a Vietnam veteran cap, looked at me thoughtfully. Finley? Sergeant, you said? Kee-san? He rubbed his chin. I knew of Finley. Wild kid from Texas. Could shoot the wings off a fly. But that was a long time ago. No idea what happened to him. It was a thread, however thin. From Texas? I asked, my hope flaring. Had the accent and everything. Loved his cowboy poetry, of all things. It wasn't much, but it was something. I went back online, this time narrowing my search. Samuel Finn Finley, Texas, Vietnam. I combed through genealogy sites, military forums, old newspaper archives. And then, I found it. A tiny, brief article from a small-town Texas newspaper from 15 years ago. Local veteran honored at school assembly. The veteran was Samuel Finley. The article mentioned he had been a Marine, a decorated sniper, and that he now lived a quiet life, volunteering at the local animal shelter. There was no address, but it named the town, Cedar Fork, a dot on the map about a 6-hour drive away. It was a long shot. He could have moved a dozen times in 15 years. But it was the only lead I had. I didn't tell David the whole story. I just said I needed some time alone, to go through my father's things, to process my grief. He understood, though I could see the concern in his eyes. He knew I was holding something back. I packed a small bag, loaded my father's lockbox into the trunk of my car, and early the next morning, I set off for Cedar Fork. The drive was long and monotonous, the landscape flattening into scrubland and dusty fields. It gave me too much time to think. What was I going to say to him? Hello, you don't know me, but you haunted my father's funeral and implied he ruined your life. Care to elaborate? This was a fool's errand. I was chasing a ghost, driven by a grief that had curdled into a desperate need for answers. Cedar Fork was exactly what its name suggested, a small, sleepy town with a main street that looked like it had been preserved in amber. I found the animal shelter easily enough. It was a modest, one-story building on the edge of town. My heart was hammering as I pulled into the gravel parking lot. What if he wasn't here? What if he was, and he told me to leave? I walked inside. The air smelled of disinfectant and dog food. A young woman with a bright smile was behind the counter. Can I help you? I'm looking for Samuel Finley, I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. I was told he volunteers here? Her smile widened. Oh, Finn. Yeah, he's out back in the kennels. Just go through that door there. You can't miss him. I thanked her and pushed through the heavy door into the kennel area. The sound of barking was immediate and deafening. Rows of chain-link cages held dogs of every size and shape, all vying for attention. And there, at the far end, was Samuel Finley. He was on his knees, his back to me, scrubbing out an empty kennel with a hose and a brush. He was wearing old, stained jeans and a t-shirt, his silver hair tied back in a short ponytail. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy, the same limp evident even in this simple task. I stood there for a moment, frozen, watching him. This was the man from the photograph. The brave, grinning soldier. The haunted stranger from the funeral. Now, he was a volunteer, cleaning up after stray dogs. The juxtaposition was jarring. He must have sensed my presence, because he turned off the hose and slowly, stiffly, got to his feet. He turned around. When he saw me, his body went still. There was no surprise on his face. It was as if he had been expecting me. "Elara," he said. His voice was just as I remembered, a low rumble of gravel and old pain. "I found your picture," I said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "In my father's things. He left me a letter." Finn nodded slowly. He wiped his hands on a rag. I wondered if he would. He looked at me, his pale blue eyes searching my face. "You have his eyes. The same storm in them. Your letter, he said you would tell me what happened. He said you would say he saved you, and that he betrayed you." My voice broke. I need to know who my father was. I need to understand the silence. Finn was silent for a long time, his gaze drifting over the barking dogs. The noise was a stark contrast to the stillness between us. "It's not a good story," he said finally, his voice soft. "It's not a story for a bright afternoon in a dog kennel." "Please," I whispered. It was all I had. He looked at me, and I saw a profound weariness in his face, a fatigue that went deeper than bones. "All right," he said. "But not here. My place is just down the road. Let me finish up here." I waited for him in the parking lot, leaning against my car, the sun warm on my face. My hands were trembling. I was terrified of what I was about to hear, and yet, I had never wanted anything more. Finn emerged a few minutes later, having changed into a clean shirt. He led the way in an old, battered pickup truck, and I followed him down a series of dusty roads to a small, isolated cabin set back in a grove of pine trees. It was neat, but Spartan. A place for a man who didn't need much. Inside, it was clean and orderly. There were no family photos, no personal knickknacks. The only decoration was a framed flag on the wall, the stars and stripes, and on the mantelpiece above a cold fireplace, a single, old photograph in a simple wooden frame. It was the same picture I had, the two of them, young and immortal. He gestured for me to sit on a worn sofa and brought me a glass of water. He sat in a rocking chair opposite me, the old wood creaking under his weight. He stared into the cold ashes of the fireplace for a long time, gathering his thoughts, gathering the strength to go back. "It was May 1968, he began, his voice taking on a distant, narrative quality. Ki-san. The siege had been going on for months. It was hell on earth. Mud, constant shelling, the smell of cordite and death. Your father and I, we were in the same squad. He was the brainy one, always with a book. I was the farm boy from Texas who could shoot. We were opposites, but we became brothers. You have to understand, in a place like that, the man next to you is the only thing that matters. He's your family. Your life is in his hands, and his in yours." He paused, swallowing hard. We were on a long-range patrol. A listening post. Just the two of us and another guy, Rodriguez. Our job was to watch a stretch of jungle, report any enemy movement. It was supposed to be a quiet night. A bitter smile touched his lips. It was never a quiet night. The NVA found us. It was a full-scale assault. Mortars, automatic fire. It came out of nowhere. Rodriguez, he was gone in the first minute. A direct hit. There was nothing left. Your father and I, we were pinned down in a shallow foxhole. We were returning fire, but there were too many of them. We were calling for artillery support, for an extraction, but the radio was jammed. The static was just, screaming. He closed his eyes, and I could see him there, a young man in the dark, terrified. Then, I took a round. Sniper. It hit me in the leg, shattered the bone. I was bleeding out, fast. Arthur, your father, he dragged me back, applied a tourniquet. He was trying to stop the bleeding, trying to return fire, all at once. I was screaming, from the pain, from the fear. I knew I was going to die in that hole. His voice dropped to a whisper. And then, we heard it. A different sound. A whirring, mechanical sound. Through the trees, we saw a light. A single, powerful beam, sweeping the jungle. It was one of ours. A new piece of tech, a mobile listening device they were testing. They called it Project Lighthouse. It was supposed to be able to pinpoint enemy positions through sound and heat signatures. It was top secret. And it was moving right towards us, right into the kill zone. I felt a chill. Lighthouse. The word from my father's notebook. The NBA saw it, too, Finn continued, his eyes still shut, lost in the memory. They knew what it was. A prize. They shifted their fire. They started targeting the lighthouse vehicle. The guys inside, they didn't stand a chance. They were engineers, not infantry. The vehicle was hit, disabled. The light went out. He opened his eyes and looked directly at me. The pain in them was so raw it was like a physical force. And then, the radio crackled to life. Command was on the line. They'd lost contact with Lighthouse. They knew its approximate position from our last transmission. They were ordering an artillery strike. A saturation barrage on the entire grid. They were going to wipe it all out, the NBA, the lighthouse, everything, to keep the technology from falling into enemy hands. My blood ran cold. I knew what was coming. I could feel it, a terrible, suffocating weight. Arthur had the radio, Finn whispered. I was lying there, half-conscious, listening. Command was asking for a confirmation of the lighthouse's coordinates. They needed a visual from the ground to make the strike effective. They asked Arthur. They said, Vance, do you have a visual on the lighthouse? Confirm its position. The room was utterly silent, waiting. And I looked at Arthur, Finn said, his voice breaking. And I knew what he was thinking. If he gave them the coordinates, the artillery would rain down. It would kill the NVA. It would destroy the lighthouse. And it would kill us, too. We were right there. There was no way we'd survive the barrage. But if he didn't give the coordinates, if the NBA captured that technology, who knows how many more of our boys would die? It was a choice between our 2 lives, and the lives of countless others. Tears were streaming down my face now. I couldn't stop them. He looked at me, Finn said, a single tear tracing a path through the weathered lines of his own cheek. He looked right into my eyes. And he picked up the radio. And he said, affirmative. I have a visual. Coordinates are. And he gave them. He gave them our position. He called the artillery down on our own heads. A sob escaped my throat. I covered my mouth with my hand. The world exploded, Finn said, his voice flat, empty. The sound. I can't describe it. It was like the earth was being torn apart. The concussions. I thought I was dead. When I woke up, it was quiet. The bombardment was over. I was buried under dirt and debris. Arthur was next to me, unconscious, but alive. Somehow, by some miracle, the pattern of the shells had missed our foxhole by a few yards. We were alive. The NVA were gone. Obliterated. The lighthouse was a smoldering wreck. He took a deep, shuddering breath. The rescue team found us a few hours later. They pulled us out. They called it a miracle. They called Arthur a hero. He had saved the technology from capture. He had taken out a company of NVA. They wanted to give him a medal. He refused. He never spoke of it again. He looked at me, his eyes full of a bottomless sorrow. He saved my life by dragging me into that hole. He saved who knows how many other lives by calling in that strike. But he also sentenced me to death in that same moment. Every day since then, I have lived with the sound of that artillery, with the knowledge that my best friend, my brother, made a choice that should have killed us both. He carried the weight of that decision. And I carried the sound of it. The betrayal of it. The love of it. How do you live with that? How do you look at the man who was willing to sacrifice you for the greater good? I understood now. The silence. The distance in my father's eyes. He hadn't just been remembering the war, he had been reliving that single, terrible moment, over and over again. The moment he had chosen duty over friendship, the many over the two. And he had lived with the miraculous, guilt-ridden aftermath of that choice every single day. He loved you, I said, my voice thick with tears. In his letter, he said you were the bravest man he ever knew. Finn nodded slowly. I loved him, too. That was the hell of it. I could never hate him. Not really. I understood why he did it. I probably would have done the same thing. But understanding something and living with it are two very different things. We came home, but we were both broken. He built his quiet life, his sanctuary. I drifted. I could never settle. The noise in my head was too loud. We stayed in touch for a few years, but it was too painful. The last time I saw him before the funeral was at your mother's service, 10 years ago. We stood on opposite sides of the cemetery, just like you and I did. We didn't speak. We just looked at each other. And we knew. We would always be the two men in that foxhole. We sat in silence for a long time, the ghosts of the past finally given voice, filling the small, quiet room. I reached into my bag and pulled out the lockbox. I opened it and took out the small, cloth Marine Corps patch. I held it out to him. I think he would have wanted you to have this, I said. Finn looked at the patch, and then at me. His weathered face crumpled for a moment, and then he took it, his fingers closing around it gently. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. I left Cedar Fork an hour later. The 6-hour drive home felt different. The landscape was the same, but I was changed. The mystery was solved. The silence had been filled with a story of unimaginable horror and impossible choice. My father wasn't just the quiet history teacher. He was a hero, and he was a man haunted by a decision that had cost him his best friend, his peace of mind. He was both. He was human. When I got home, David was waiting for me. I told him everything. I showed him the lockbox, the photograph, I told him about Finn, about Kisan, about the lighthouse. He listened, his hand holding mine, his presence a steady anchor in the storm of my emotions. I'm so sorry, Alara, he said when I finished. What a terrible burden for him to carry. It was, I said. But he carried it so I wouldn't have to. He built this quiet, safe life for me, a life without rain, without the sound of artillery. He did his duty, and then he came home and built a world where duty was a quiet thing, a thing of love and family. A few weeks later, a small package arrived in the mail. There was no return address, but the postmark was from Cedar Fork. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was the old photograph of my father and Finn. And tucked into the frame was a note, written in a shaky, but firm hand. Ilara. He would have wanted you to have this. He talked about you all the time in his letters. You were his sanctuary. You were the life he saved. Keep building. Finn. I placed the photograph on my own mantelpiece, next to a picture of my father and me on my graduation day. The two versions of him, side by side. The young soldier and the old teacher. The man of war and the man of peace. I finally saw the whole structure of his life, the load-bearing walls of duty and love, the scars that gave it strength. I am an architect. I build things. I understand that the strongest foundations are sometimes laid over the deepest fractures. My father's life was a testament to that. He was a man who saved a life by being willing to end it, a man who betrayed his friend to be loyal to his country, a man who built a world of silence to protect his daughter from the noise of his past. The stranger at my father's funeral knew my name, and he gave me the secret my father took to his grave. And in doing so, he gave me back my father, not as a saint or a monster, but as a man. A whole, complicated, brave, and broken man. And I understood, finally, that the greatest legacy a parent can leave is not a perfect story, but a true one. And the moral of that story, the line I will carry with me always, is the one my father lived every day after that foxhole. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is not to fight the battle, but to live with the peace you were forced to create.